Um, Thank you for being here this afternoon for this really fascinating day of conversations about tea culture in China, and the whole day has been really fascinating. It's a pleasure to be able to participate and join you and be part of this really remarkable roster of guests. So Livio, thank you and your institution for bringing us all here today. So today I want to talk about art history without the art, the curious case of Sino-Vietnamese teapots before 1700. We all learned an awful lot from Wing Chi, and I wish that I had been able to see his presentation before so that I could incorporate more stuff into my talk, but we'll do it together perhaps. So this is a new project for me. Brought on about as a response to my work with the new Global Tea Initiative for the study of tea culture and science at my campus. And so this is research that's still in preliminary stages, but I have found enough evidence at this point, I think, that it's reasonable to share it with you, and in sharing it, I hope to get feedback and advance my work through your help. So this project engages a new approach in academia. Actually, it's not that new, but for the last decade or so, in academia, the issue of border crossings or studies of border crossings and border studies have been promoted. That is to study not just one culture, but another in relation to it, so that by conducting border studies, it is the cross-cultural understandings that ensue that are very helpful. And so by learning more about how two or more countries engage with each other, the similarities and differences of each are more strongly highlighted, and from that, we can learn even more about both than we would by studying them individually. So I decided to accept the challenge of this new approach by considering China's visual traditions from outside of China, and with a focus on teapots as a way to understand China and tea culture. Through them, what could we learn about China vis-a-vis its border states? By comparing Chinese and Southeast Asian teapots, especially in the Ming period, at the very least, we could find out how similar or different their tea cultures were. I decided to begin my search with a comparison between China and Vietnam. This comparative study of Sino-Viet teaware gives me the opportunity not to go down the well-trodden path of the great land and maritime trade routes that took tea and tea culture from China to other parts of East Asia, to Europe, and the New World in the 17th century, but instead to go in a different direction, south and westward into Southeast Asia. This made me realize that the global issues could be considered on a more local or glocal scale. Preliminary findings in this project are indicating that the Sino-Viet tea trade could have a broader global impact. So, although my findings are rather preliminary, I'm happy to share them with you today. So, a confession. I am a sinologist, not an expert on Vietnam or Southeast Asia. Still, it turns out that my interdisciplinary training in Chinese art history is not only useful, it's also essential. As John Guy, who's the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, points out, intensive comparative study between Vietnamese ceramics and contemporaneous Chinese ceramics must be addressed. Doing this permits informed analysis of style, which draws on the extensive body of knowledge of Chinese ceramics development, especially as this relates to problems of dating. Moreover, the Southeast Asian art historian John Guy also observes the ethnohistorical knowledge of Vietnamese culture is little examined. Within this category, I can now confidently assert, even less has been done on Vietnamese tea culture and teaware before 1700. So it's a wide open field. Although quite a bit has been written about Vietnamese ceramics when compared to other Southeast Asian states, Vietnamese ceramics are nonetheless grossly understudied. So, much to my surprise and delight, it turns out this project is actually a good idea. Excuse me. I have to admit that I thought this was going to be a fast and easy research project. I'd just get some books on ceramics from Chinese and Vietnamese ceramics collections, compare a few teapots, explain the evidence, and be done. That was my hope and ideal. Ha ha ha. I soon discovered otherwise. Usually, I start with an object and a question, and then try to answer the question about it through interdisciplinary evidence. In this project, surprisingly, the artifacts just didn't show up. Some questions you might be asking yourself now are, why teapots? And how can teapots be so informative? Or for that matter, you might be saying, is this woman crazy? The first answer is that because ceramics production generally is a utilitarian art form, form follows function. It is with the advent of steeped tea leaves, as opposed to whisked tea powder, sometime before the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, which began in 1368, that the teapot shape may have started to become necessary. In other words, it should be the case that the transition from whisked tea powder is marked with the development of the teapot. I said should. Distinguishing teapots from other vessels early on turns out to be not as easy as one might expect. Still, what do we expect a teapot to look like? The Chinese-style teapot from early on in the Ming tends to look like what we expect to become, what we expect of a classic teapot shape. And here are two early examples. You need a spout for pouring on one side that extends to the top of the shoulder, a handle typically on the opposite back side or looped over the top from front to back. You need a handle that lifts away from the body to protect the fingers from getting burned. That's essential. You need a secure lid that won't fall off when the vessel is tipped for pouring. You need a stable, flat base and an opening big enough at the top to remove the spent leaves. And also, typically, a round body in which the leaves can swirl during infusion. In this rare Vietnamese hanging scroll, called The Triumphant Return of a Military Mandarin from the late 18th century, the military mandarin pauses to share a cup of tea. Although the surface of this scroll is much abraded, a teapot is clearly set out with small teacups on a low table. That's the detail on the left right here, you see them. The pouring vessel has the standard shape one expects of a classically shaped teapot. This, as I said, is from Vietnam in the late 18th century. Before 1700, however, the story for Vietnamese tea culture and teaware has yet to be written. The period between about 1300 to 1700 is interesting because this is when steeped tea became the most prominent way to prepare tea in China, and as a consequence, teapots became necessary objects. As is well known to you here in this audience, in parts of China by 1378, the fashion for whisked tea was giving way to brewed loose-leaf tea. Then, in 1391, the first Ming emperor decreed that only loose-leaf tea would be what the court would accept for tribute teas. This target period, 1300 to 1700, also is fascinating because it is before the worldwide trade in tea really started heating up. So it gives us an opportunity to study more local development before this happened. Right, I know. Oh, you can do that too. All right, I use about circa 1700 as a terminus for my study because after 1700, the story is much clearer for Vietnam and the rest of the world. By the 18th century, and especially by the 19th century, the teapot shape had stabilized, as had the format for serving tea, such that tea sets, such as this on the screen, became commonplace. My interest is what happens before 1700. In other words, when does a teapot become a teapot? And for that matter, where does a teapot become a teapot? And why only teapots? Why not teacups? As much as teacup shapes also can be distinctive and shift with the style of tea from boiled to whisked to steeped, or all at the same time, as Livio will tell us, They offer their own set of complex issues, so that that can be one of my future projects, not first. After all, you first have to make the tea before you can drink it. So I'm going to begin with teapots. So one of the reasons why finding out about teapots and teaware is so difficult is because museum labels and books rarely state the function of the ceramic pot, cup, or bowl. Most typically, the reader learns that an object is a pouring vessel, but not specifically what beverage was meant to be poured. Fair enough. After all, the original function of a vessel can be lost or completely changed with personal use. This enamelware metal wash bowl made in China in the early 1990s on the left was no more meant to contain a basket full of vitamins than this little flower pot on the right was meant to contain paper clips. And even though pillows tend to look like pillows, even this familiar object can take on culture and time-specific shapes. For example, a pillow in the 13th and 14th century Vietnam on the right could look very much like a pillow in Ming Dynasty China on the left. Both have cupped surface for the head supported by a decorative base. Therefore, for this project, it's essential to tread very carefully, putting aside expectations of what a teapot looks like today for what it actually looked like before 1700 and in Vietnam, and distinguishing between teapots and vessels for other beverages. Nonetheless, one can try to figure out what the vessels of this time likely were meant to carry. In this case, on the object on the left, the curators at the Imperial Household Museum in Hanoi simply identified this as a pot with carved leaf motif from the Ming Dynasty, which dates from 1527 to 1594. Although it looks very much like a Ming Dynasty teapot datable to 1533 on the right, it is not identified as a teapot by the Vietnamese curators. Still, sometimes we can know an object's original function. Because of other historical evidence, which I will share with you in a moment, it is likely that the vessel on the left was meant to be a teapot. It's also important to set some other limits. So for this project, my interest is not in the objects that went from one country, such as Vietnam, and which were then adapted for use in tea service in another, such as Vietnam, and these objects on the screen. This is because, as I've just mentioned, the original purpose of these objects may or may not have had anything to do with tea. Rather, my interest is in the objects that were made specifically for tea service in Vietnam or China and for Vietnamese consumption. On the one hand, I am looking for Vietnamese vessels that pay homage to Chinese traditions, and also, on the other hand, for those celebrating local Southeast Asian ones. This is important because learning about when a teapot becomes a teapot and where a teapot becomes a teapot helps us trace the spread of China's tea culture. More fundamentally, through this process, we can learn how cultures form by adopting, transforming, or rejecting the physical and tangible manifestations of other values and cultural forces. And we can learn about the forces, economic, agricultural, political, social, and cultural, etc., that make it so. Looking specifically at Vietnam, the reason why we may reasonably expect to find teapots in Vietnam are many. For one, Vietnam grows tea indigenously. Vietnam is part of what I call the indigenous tea belt, which extends from northeast India across Southeast Asia into southwest and southeast China. Tea culture was developing right across Vietnam's border in Yunnan long before the Ming Dynasty. Research shows that the Yunnan-Sichuan area was exporting teas to Tibet by the 8th century and possibly even as early as the 3rd or 4th centuries. Later, in the Ming, even more tea from southern Yunnan, that is, even closer to Vietnam, was being produced and traded to Tibet. Therefore, there is no good reason why people in Vietnam would not have been producing tea like their Yunnanese neighbors. 2. Consequently, because of the porous nature of borders and the indigenous tea plants already in situ, Vietnam definitely had to have had its own tea culture or cultures. This could, however, have been distinct from China's, or not. Like the Chinese, Vietnamese myth holds that the divine farmer Shan Nong was first to discover tea. In Vietnam today, tea is important to many people from birth to death. When babies are born, they are bathed in tea to protect their skin. When a couple marries, the engagement ceremony is a tea ceremony. When people die, the corpse is covered with tea leaves within the coffin. We can expect that sometimes the tea wearing practice of Vietnam will be identical to China, and sometimes not. Another reason why we may expect to find teapots in Vietnam is that, unlike most of the rest of Southeast Asia, Vietnam has had a robust ceramics industry for millennia. And because throughout the centuries, Vietnam has had ties, political, trade, and cultural ties with China, sometimes close, sometimes fraught. This includes the Ming Dynasty. During the Ming, when steeped tea preparations dominated all others for the first time, envoys to China from the tribute state of Vietnam strategically displayed their knowledge of Chinese culture to the Chinese court as a diplomatic and state-preserving tactic. With tea culture in China taking elite forms and the most elite being for steep tea, it only stands to reason that the Vietnamese envoys' understanding of Chinese culture must have included a solid grasp of Chinese tea culture in all its current fashions. They would have had to understand the necessity of a teapot, whatever shape that meant. All right, another reason. Not only did Vietnam send envoys to the Chinese Ming court and then return to Vietnam to explain Chinese culture to the rulers, but also, back in Vietnam, Vietnamese artisans had to serve 3 months of every year working in the Vietnamese court. There they learned to make the most up-to-date prestige objects for the court. And those prestige objects must have included tea ware. And they would make those for the royal family. Then, the way forces of prestige and desire work in society, we can reasonably expect that once back to their hometowns, these artisans would have continued making objects in this mode, spreading imperial culture and Chinese-style tea culture throughout the rest of Vietnam. Sorry. Therefore, it seems reasonable to argue that Vietnam must have developed its own tea culture, both local and also Chinese style, and made its own vessels to suit these varying needs. All historical evidence supports this claim. The question remains, where are the teapots? In fact, in my research so far, what I've found is lots of historical evidence, political, social, and economic, but almost no physical evidence. That is, almost no artifacts. Most of that seems to have been destroyed. So, at least in this initial stage of my investigation. So what we have mostly is an art history without the art. But what evidence there is suggests an even more complex story. Part of the story surely involves the trade in ceramic ware between China and Vietnam. In China's early Ming Dynasty, Admiral Zheng He's immense treasure ships carried soldiers, diplomatic specialists, medical personnel, astronomers, and scholars of foreign ways to central Vietnam, among other places further west. It can be no mere coincidence that the site on Vietnam's eastern coast where Admiral Zheng He landed was Quy Nguyen, one of Vietnam's historically most important ceramic kiln sites. Back in China, as art historian Eva Strober has explained, porcelain produced in China's porcelain capital Jingdezhen was often made in shapes and decorated with designs specifically suited to the usage and taste of this important Vietnamese market. As well, by the 17th century, teapots were being made for Vietnam at another of China's major teaware producing sites, Yixing. In other words, China made Vietnamese-style ceramics for Vietnam and at its most important ceramic kiln sites. So what are these? Here are some. These early 18th century teapots, mostly white now, were made at Jingdezhen and originally decorated with overglazed enamel colors and possibly also underglazed blue painting, found in a 1713 shipwreck on a ship I think bound for Vietnam, the decoration has washed off. This little pot, made in the 18th and 19th century Yixing for Vietnamese consumption, is another. It characterizes one aspect of Vietnamese aesthetics distinct from Chinese aesthetics. Unlike Yixing pots made for the Chinese market, the surface of this vessel has been burnished to a high sheen. This appealed to the Chinese market, but sisha pots of this type made for the Chinese consumers are rarely shiny. So, because China made Vietnamese-style ceramics and teaware before 1700, it follows that there must also first be Vietnam-made ceramic models for them to work from. As a general rule, Chinese potters have always required models for their own work, and given Vietnam's fine ceramic tradition and practices and its political situation as a tribute state to China, Vietnam also must have had Chinese-style teapots for its own local consumption. Either way, there must be Chinese-style teapots made in Vietnam before 1300 to 1700, as well as Vietnamese-style tea vessels developed for use in local tea cultures in this period. And finally, yet another reason to expect to find teapots in Vietnam is that in 17th century Vietnam, Japanese and Chinese merchants were already well entrenched at Hanoi and Hue. In fact, Chinese merchants were continuously active in Vietnam. Given China's recognized importance as a ceramics manufacturer, it only stands to reason that these merchants would have been trading in ceramics. To return to the point about politics, China and Vietnam have always had a political relationship, as I've mentioned. Sometimes it was friendly, sometimes not so. After Vietnam declared independence from China in the 10th century, Vietnam nonetheless found it useful to send diplomatic missions to China every 3 years. So there was a continued political relationship between Vietnam and China over the years. And also, China occupied Vietnam with uneven success and influence at various times, including a 20-year period in the early 15th century when steeped tea was the official style of tea in China. In these missions, the Vietnamese envoys strategically displayed their high level of fluency in Chinese culture as a way to demonstrate that they did not need China's help to become civilized. They didn't want the Chinese to come back to their country and colonize them again. So to keep them out, they had to display what they knew of Chinese culture, display that they were cultivated. And these missions brought back books and other items of interest. As Southeast Asian historian Keith Taylor argues, part of the historic Vietnamese pattern of survival has been to display a sharp knowledge of China. So what is more Chinese than tea? Taylor further explains that Vietnamese were generally quick to produce their own Chinese-style items. The question is, where are the Chinese-style teapots made in Vietnam? With a preponderance of historical evidence for production and exchange of ceramic teaware, there is a surprising lack of physical evidence. The situation is even more odd when one looks at other surviving early objects. They exist. The fact of the matter is that Vietnam copied Chinese vessel shapes for centuries. They copied water and wine-shaped vessels of these types on the screen. The larger vessels are made in Vietnam based on Chinese prototypes, and the Chinese prototypes are inset in the small example on the screen. So you have the Meiping shape on the left, which was originally meant to be a wine container, and the Yuhuchun shaped wine vessel in the center, and then this ewer in an Islamic metalwork shape that was adapted for wine also once it arrived in China. And these are being copied in Vietnam and survive. Also, the Vietnamese copied this vessel shape from the Five Dynasties to Song Dynasty period, which was apparently used for wine when it came to Vietnam. Vietnamese produced that kind of shape in the 13th, 14th century in the example in the middle, and the 15th century in the example on the far right. These are interesting. They look so much like teapots, but of course, because the handle is too small and too close to the body, it couldn't have been meant to hold tea with almost boiling hot water because your fingers would burn. It wouldn't be comfortable. And it would be difficult to pick up and pour successfully. So it's an interesting shape, probably a precursor to what we think of as a teapot. So in addition to these, from before 1700, I found plenty of water pots in a variety of Southeast Asian shapes, such as the kandi on the left. I found wine pots of various Chinese shape, as those I just showed you in the middle. And I found local-style water droppers and lime pots on the far right. But only this teapot-shaped vessel this is the only one that I've identified as made in Vietnam before 1700. And this is the one that was excavated at the Thang Long Imperial Citadel in Hanoi City. This imperial citadel served as the imperial palace or residence for centuries. Again, this is curious because all of the historical evidence that argues there must be more. But this is it. And what about teapots from other Southeast Asian sites before 1700? A search for teapots there has proven even more problematic. In fact, I have found no teapot shapes from the other tea belt regions of Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar. What does this mean for Vietnam, and especially since tea grew in the wild in Vietnam and across Southeast Asia into Northeast India? And because Vietnam had virtually always had trade, diplomatic, and cultural relations with China, and because Vietnam today believes it has had a tea-drinking culture since the time of the legendary Chinese god Shen Nong, since Vietnam was copying Chinese prototypes for water and wine for centuries, and for that matter, other things like pillows, where are the early teapots? Was tea so special that the Vietnamese preferred to use only teapots from China when they drank it? So we should be looking for Ming teapots in Vietnam instead of Vietnamese versions? If so, where are those? Or, unlike the teapot forms in the rest of the world, is the Vietnamese teapot shape significantly different, and I've just missed it? Or was tea used primarily as a medicine there, so it is the other vessel shapes that were required? What does this evident lack of physical evidence in the face of a preponderance of historical evidence tell us about the relationships, political, trade, cultural, and social, between Vietnam and China in the Ming period and later that indicate that Vietnam must have had Chinese-style tea culture? Only further research will tell. That's all. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Burnett, for this beautiful and very informative presentation about this aspect of Chinese.